There are cities that keep secrets the way desert sand keeps heat, long after the sun disappears, long after the air cools enough for people to breathe comfortably again. The heat remains beneath the surface, waiting. Phoenix, Arizona. In 1931 was that kind of city. Not yet the endless modern sprawl it would later become. Still smaller then. Raw. A city carved from desert by ambition, irrigation water, and the stubborn American belief that any landscape could be forced into submission if enough effort was applied. The streets stretched wide and flat beneath the Arizona sky. The buildings stayed low to the ground, as though they understood something about the desert sun that newcomers had not yet learned, and the light, even in October, had a quality unlike anywhere else in America, white, direct, relentless, turning everything either brilliant or invisible, with very little in between. But when evening arrived, the city changed. The heat softened slightly. The neon signs flickered alive. Restaurants filled. Music drifted from bars and dance halls. And people who had spent the day surviving the desert finally emerged into the night. It was into this city, in the autumn of 1931, that Winnie Ruth Judd came. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, charming, animated in a way people noticed immediately. The kind of woman who altered the atmosphere of a room simply by entering it. People remembered her, even years later. But beneath that energy, something else existed, because by nearly every account from people who knew her then, Winnie Ruth Judd was deeply unhappy. Before marriage, her name had been Winnie Ruth McKinnell. She was born in 1905 in Oxford, Indiana, the daughter of a Methodist minister. Her childhood was shaped by church life, small-town expectations, and the quiet pressure placed upon ministers' families to appear respectable at all times. She was intelligent, musical, social, a good student. The kind of young woman people expected would eventually settle into a stable and ordinary life. But life rarely follows expectation for very long. Winnie trained as a medical secretary, a practical choice. She understood she would likely need to support herself, and she possessed the intelligence and discipline to do it well. She worked in hospitals and clinics across the Midwest, learning medicine, learning procedures, learning the detailed language of medication and treatment. Knowledge that would later become deeply significant in ways nobody could yet imagine. Then came illness, tuberculosis. In the 1920s, tuberculosis haunted America with quiet persistence. It filled sanatoriums across Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado with patients sent west in search of dry air and recovery. The disease changed lives even when it did not end them. It altered the shape of the future, created uncertainty, fear, a strange awareness that time itself could not be trusted. And in Winnie Ruth McKinnell, the illness seems to have created something else as well, a restless intensity, a hunger for life sharpened by the awareness that life itself might not last. Tuberculosis brought her west, and in the West, it brought her to a man named William Judd. William Judd was 24 years older than Winnie, a physician, divorced, a man who had already lived enough life to carry visible traces of disappointment. Their marriage in 1924 joined two people who both needed something from the other. Whether either truly found it remains difficult to know. What is clear is that the marriage quickly became defined by distance. William's medical work moved him frequently. At times, Winnie followed. At other times, she remained behind. Their relationship increasingly existed through letters, temporary reunions, and long stretches of separation. Loneliness settled quietly into the marriage, and by the autumn of 1931, Winnie Ruth Judd was living alone in Phoenix, while her husband worked in Mexico. She had a job at the Grunow Clinic on North 2nd Street. She worked efficiently, competently, handling records and medical files with the precision expected of someone trained carefully in that world. She had an apartment, she had routines, and for a time, she had two close friends, Anne Leroy and Sammy Samuelson. The newspapers would later turn those names into symbols. But in October of 1931, they were simply two women who had become part of Winnie's social world. Anne Leroy was 30, confident, professionally capable, the kind of woman who seemed comfortable almost everywhere she went. Sammy Samuelson, whose real name was Agnes, though almost nobody used it anymore, was younger, lighter in personality, warm, easy to like. The three women spent enormous amounts of time together. They attended dances, social gatherings, restaurants, the ordinary nightlife of Phoenix during the early years of the Depression. And somewhere during those months, something changed. Exactly what changed remains uncertain even now. The historical record never fully settles into clarity. There were rumors afterward, always rumors. Stories about jealousy, about romantic tensions involving a man, about emotional fractures growing quietly beneath the surface of friendship. There were stories about money, arguments, changing loyalties, the kind of complicated emotional chemistry that develops between people who have once been extremely close, and then suddenly are not. People later described Winnie as emotionally unstable during the weeks leading up to October 1931. They spoke of mood swings, fear, desperation, letters she had written, conversations that, in hindsight, felt alarming. But hindsight changes everything. People reconstruct warning signs after tragedy because tragedy demands explanation, and explanations are comforting, even when they are incomplete. What remains undeniable is this. Winnie Ruth Judd was lonely. She was physically fragile from illness, separated from her husband, living in a city that did not entirely feel like home, working a job that occupied her time without truly anchoring her life. And somewhere inside that loneliness, fear had begun to grow. She owned a revolver, small, easy to conceal. She later claimed she purchased it because she was afraid. Afraid of what exactly? Her explanations changed over time. Sometimes she spoke of threats, sometimes intruders, sometimes tensions with the other women, sometimes something harder to define. But the fear itself appears genuine, and perhaps that matters more than the exact object of it. Outside, Phoenix continued moving through the autumn of 1931. The desert heat sank slowly into the ground each evening. Newspapers carried stories of the Depression. Dance halls played music for crowds trying desperately to forget uncertainty for a few hours. And Winnie Ruth Judd sat inside her apartment on North 2nd Street, writing letters to her husband in Mexico, going to work each morning, trying perhaps to hold herself together, waiting for something to change, though she may not have known what. The night of October 16th, 1931 began like any other night. That is often how catastrophe arrives, quietly, without warning, without announcing itself as different from all the ordinary evenings that came before it. The air in Phoenix carried the same dry desert warmth it had carried for weeks. The heat of the day still lingered faintly in the streets, and somewhere beyond the city, beyond the electric lights and passing automobiles, the citrus groves rested in darkness beneath the Arizona sky. Winnie Ruth Judd left her apartment on Brill Street that evening and walked toward the duplex on North 2nd Street, where Anne Leroy and Sammy Samuelson lived. She carried her purse, and inside her purse, a small revolver. Later she would say she brought the gun because she was frightened, because tensions between herself and the two women had grown unbearable, because something about the situation felt dangerous. Whether that explanation was entirely true, whether it mattered legally, whether fear alone can ever fully explain what followed, those questions would remain unresolved long after the trial ended. What is known is simpler. Winnie arrived at the duplex late that evening. There was an argument, and when the argument ended, Anne Leroy was dead from a gunshot wound. Sammy Samuelson was dead from a gunshot wound and suffocation. Exactly what happened inside that apartment has never been fully established. Not in the complete and certain way courts prefer. Winnie later claimed self-defense. She said Anne struggled with her for the revolver, that the first shot happened during the struggle, that panic followed, confusion, violence moving faster than thought itself. The prosecution told another story entirely, and the newspapers created yet another version, a version simpler, darker, more dramatic, the version most Americans eventually came to believe. But on the night itself, there were no headlines yet, no courtroom, no reporters, only the apartment on North 2nd Street, and Winnie Ruth Judd standing inside the aftermath of something irreversible. What happened next became the detail that fixed itself permanently in public memory. Not the killings themselves, but what followed afterward, because rather than calling the police, Winnie went home, then returned, and over the next day, with a practicality that horrified the nation once it became known, she began dealing with the problem of two bodies inside an apartment. She had trunks, large steamer trunks, heavy luggage designed for long train journeys and ocean travel, anonymous objects, ordinary objects, the sort of things thousands of travelers carried through American train stations every day. The details of what happened inside that apartment over the following hours are both documented and unbearable. The medical testimony later given in court described everything with precise clinical language, cold, exact, mechanical, as though precision itself could somehow protect people from the reality being described. But reality remained, and when the trunks were finally packed, they were heavy, very heavy. Winnie arranged transportation to the Southern Pacific Railroad depot in Phoenix. The station stood beneath yellow electric lights and drifting desert dust. A modestly grand building from the optimistic railroad age before the Depression hardened much of America into something more exhausted. Passengers moved across the platforms, porters carried luggage, voices echoed beneath the high ceilings, and into that ordinary movement of travel and routine. Winnie Ruth Judd arrived on the evening of October 18th. She had a ticket for Los Angeles. She had the trunks. And by outward appearance, she looked calm, appropriately dressed, controlled, polite with station employees, exactly like countless other travelers moving through American train stations in 1931. But one of the trunks was leaking. A baggage handler noticed first, then another employee. There was a stain, a smell not quite right, something heavy and unnatural about the trunk itself. Questions were asked. Winnie answered carefully. She said she did not have the key. The matter remained unresolved just long enough for the train to depart, and by the following morning, Winnie Ruth Judd arrived in Los Angeles. But back in Phoenix, people had already begun investigating. The discovery itself happened on October 19 at the Southern Pacific Depot in Los Angeles. The trunks had been checked as baggage. They sat waiting among ordinary luggage until railroad employees, acting on warnings sent from Phoenix, forced them open. What they found became national news within hours. The Los Angeles Examiner, the Arizona Republic, the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle. Soon, newspapers across the country carried the same horrifying story. 2 women discovered inside trunks at Los Angeles train station. The headlines spread quickly through the wire services of Depression-era America. Fast, breathless, perfectly designed for shock. And with those headlines came the phrase that would follow Winnie Ruth Judd for the rest of her life: the trunk murderess. The newspapers loved the phrase because it reduced everything into something immediate and unforgettable. A woman, 2 bodies, trunks, a train journey. The details felt grotesquely cinematic, and America became obsessed. But names created by newspapers rarely allow room for complexity. The phrase trunk murderess transformed Winnie from a person into a symbol before the legal process had even properly begun. And symbols are much easier to judge than people. For several days after the discovery, Winnie disappeared into Los Angeles. Not truly hidden, not planned well enough for that, but lost. Drifting through the enormous city in a state that later descriptions would struggle to define clearly. She wandered, slept irregularly, barely ate, exhausted, injured, psychologically shattered, at least according to her later account. Eventually, she contacted her brother, Burton McKinnell, who lived in Los Angeles. He contacted a lawyer. The lawyer contacted police. And on October 23, 1931, 7 days after the killings, Winnie Ruth Judd surrendered herself to the Los Angeles Police Department. Witnesses later described her as thin, pale, exhausted. Her hand was bandaged from an injury sustained during the struggle in the apartment. The wound had become infected. She looked physically diminished, but what people noticed most was not weakness. It was composure. She spoke calmly, answered questions steadily, displayed almost no outward emotion, and this composure disturbed people. Some believed it proved coldness, that only a heartless person could remain so calm after something so terrible. Others believed the opposite, that she was in shock, that her mind had shut down emotionally in order to survive what had happened. And others saw something even more complicated: a minister's daughter, a doctor's wife, a woman raised to maintain calmness regardless of suffering, performing composure because composure was the only thing she had left. Which explanation was correct? The historical record never fully answers. What remains is the image itself. A woman seated in a Los Angeles interrogation room in October of 1931, bandaged hand resting quietly in her lap, answering questions beneath electric light while the largest newspapers in America prepared to transform her into something almost mythological. The newspapers named her before she was formally tried. In the journalism culture of the early 1930s, this was entirely normal. The press did not merely report criminal cases. It constructed narratives around them, and the narrative surrounding Winnie Ruth Judd was irresistible. A woman, violence, trunks, train stations, flight across state lines. It possessed everything sensational journalism required. Complexity disappeared quickly. The loneliness, the illness, the emotional collapse, the damaged friendships, the uncertainty surrounding the exact sequence of violence inside the apartment. All of it became secondary to the story Americans preferred. The trunk murderess. Simple stories travel further than complicated ones. And this story traveled everywhere. Meanwhile, investigators in Phoenix examined the apartment on North 2nd Street. Photographs were taken. Witnesses questioned. Evidence collected with the investigative methods available in 1931. The apartment told a partial story. A violent struggle had clearly occurred. The physical evidence showed desperation. Chaos inside a confined space. People fighting with a terrible intensity that only appears when survival itself feels uncertain. The revolver was identified, the trunks traced, timelines reconstructed, but evidence cannot record thought. It cannot explain fear or panic or psychological collapse. It can only show what happened physically, not emotionally. And that became the central question surrounding Winnie Ruth Judd. Not simply what she had done, but why. What existed inside her mind before, during, and after the violence. The trial would attempt to answer that question. The trial would fail, because some human questions resist final explanation, no matter how many courtrooms attempt to force them into certainty. Winnie Ruth Judd was extradited back to Arizona and charged with first-degree murder, the most serious charge possible. The prosecution intended to pursue the death penalty. The defense prepared to fight desperately against it. And by early November of 1931, Phoenix transformed into something almost unrecognizable beneath the pressure of national attention. Reporters arrived from Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, hotel lobbies filled with journalists, courthouse steps crowded with photographers, restaurants and bars echoed with speculation about the woman now known nationwide as the trunk murderess. The trial had not yet officially begun, but in another sense, it had already started long before the courtroom doors ever opened. The trial of Winnie Ruth Judd began in January of 1932, and from the very beginning, it no longer felt entirely like a trial. It felt like a national spectacle. Every morning, people gathered outside the courthouse in Phoenix before the doors even opened. Some came out of curiosity, some out of outrage, some because they had followed the story from the beginning through newspaper headlines that transformed tragedy into serialized drama. And some came simply because America during the Depression had developed a strange fascination with criminal trials. Not quite entertainment, not quite civic duty. Something suspended uneasily between the two. The newspapers covered every detail relentlessly. Witness testimony, courtroom arguments, the expressions on Winnie Ruth Judd's face, the clothing she wore, whether she cried, whether she did not cry, whether her silence appeared cold or frightened or unnatural. Because in 1932, a woman accused of murder was expected to behave in very specific ways. She was expected to weep visibly, to appear broken beneath the weight of accusation, to perform innocence through recognizable emotion. And Winnie Ruth Judd did not always do this. Sometimes she appeared emotional, sometimes distant, sometimes calm in ways people found deeply unsettling. And the inconsistency itself became suspicious. The prosecution used it carefully. The newspapers amplified it eagerly, because inconsistency in a woman's emotions was often treated, in that era, almost as evidence itself. The defense argued self-defense. The prosecution argued premeditated murder. And after relatively brief deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence was death. Arizona carried out executions by hanging in 1932. The sentence shocked even some people who believed Winnie was guilty. And as news spread across the country, letters began arriving at the prison, at the governor's office, at the offices of Winnie's attorneys. Some demanded execution, others begged for mercy. But increasingly, another question began appearing beneath the public arguments, a quieter question. Was Winnie Ruth Judd sane? The defense had already attempted to raise this issue during the trial. They presented evidence suggesting psychological instability, emotional collapse, behavior inconsistent with full rational control. But the court rejected much of it. Still, the question refused to disappear, because something about Winnie unsettled people in ways difficult to define cleanly. Her composure, her contradictions, her shift in explanations, the strange emotional atmosphere surrounding the entire case. Doctors examined her, and the doctors disagreed. Some believed she was legally sane, others did not. Some described her as unstable, others as manipulative, and others seemed unable to fully decide what they believed after speaking with her, which perhaps was itself revealing, because certain minds resist easy explanation. Eventually, Arizona's governor intervened. The execution was delayed, then delayed again, and finally, in April of 1933, the sentence was commuted from death to life imprisonment on grounds of insanity. Winnie Ruth Judd was transferred to the Arizona State Hospital for the Insane. And there, the second strange chapter of her life began. The hospital stood on the edge of Phoenix beneath the desert sun, a sprawling institutional complex built according to the psychiatric philosophies of an earlier era. Long corridors, iron beds, locked wards, harsh electric lighting, and the atmosphere common to many psychiatric institutions of the early 20th century. An atmosphere somewhere between care and confinement. Places like this existed across America in the 1930s, understaffed, overcrowded, operating with incomplete understandings of mental illness and limited methods of treatment. Some staff members were compassionate, others indifferent, many exhausted. Patients disappeared quietly into such institutions for years, sometimes for life. Winnie adapted quickly. By most accounts, she became a model patient, cooperative, intelligent, useful. Her skills as a medical secretary made her valuable inside the institution's daily operations. She understood paperwork, organization, routine, and she carried herself with the same calm efficiency that had once made her respected at the Grunow Clinic. But there was another detail about Winnie Ruth Judd that gradually became almost legendary inside Arizona. She escaped, again and again and again, 7 times in total. The escapes themselves were rarely dramatic. No violent confrontations, no elaborate conspiracies. Usually they happened quietly. A lapse in supervision, an unlocked door, a moment where institutional attention drifted elsewhere, and Winnie would simply leave. The first escape happened in 1939, 8 years after the murders. She remained free only a few days before being discovered and returned. But afterward, something strange developed around the story. The newspapers reported each escape almost with disbelief, sometimes even with a faint tone of exhausted amusement, because every time the institution tightened procedures, Winnie eventually found another opening and disappeared again. The seventh escape became the most extraordinary. In 1962, Winnie Ruth Judd vanished once more. This time, she remained free for nearly 7 years. 7 years living quietly in California under another name. 7 years working as a housekeeper and caregiver for an elderly woman. 7 years waking each morning and living what appeared, from the outside, to be an entirely ordinary life. She cooked meals, cleaned rooms, went shopping, spoke politely with neighbors, and according to the few people who knew her during that period, she seemed calm, capable, unremarkable, a quiet older woman living a quiet life in a quiet town. The woman she cared for eventually learned who she really was and kept the secret. Why exactly, nobody ever fully understood. Perhaps sympathy, perhaps loneliness, perhaps because after years of knowing Winnie personally, the terrifying figure from the newspaper headlines no longer seemed entirely real. 7 years passed this way, until finally, in 1969, a journalist discovered her identity. The revelation created headlines once again, though America itself had changed enormously by then. The country in 1969 was consumed by Vietnam, civil unrest, political assassinations, the moon landing. Compared to those enormous national events, the rediscovery of Winnie Ruth Judd felt almost like an echo from another century. Still, she was returned to Arizona, and eventually, after decades inside institutions and prisons, she was formally released. She was 77 years old, an old woman now. The famous trunk murderess transformed slowly into someone quieter, more distant from the mythology that had once consumed America. She lived quietly during her final years in Arizona, occasionally giving interviews, speaking selectively about the case, never fully explaining what happened inside the apartment on North 2nd Street, or perhaps never fully able to, because across decades her explanations shifted slightly, not completely contradictory, but never entirely stable either. And historians studying the case later noticed something unsettling. The further Winnie moved from 1931, the more difficult certainty became. Not easier, because time changes memory, trauma changes memory, and decades spent living inside a public narrative can slowly alter a person's relationship to their own past. Winnie Ruth Judd died in October of 1998. She was 93 years old. She had survived 67 years beyond the night in Phoenix, long enough to outlive almost everyone connected to the case. The lawyers, the reporters, the detectives, even many of the people who remembered the headlines themselves. And by the end of the 20th century, the world that created the story had almost entirely vanished. The old Southern Pacific station was gone. The apartment on North 2nd Street was gone. The Phoenix of 1931 had disappeared beneath highways, suburbs, and modern glass buildings. Even the newspapers that once obsessed over her case had changed beyond recognition. Only fragments remained: old photographs, court records, faded headlines, and the strange enduring fascination surrounding Winnie Ruth Judd herself. Because in the end, The story never became simple. The newspapers wanted simplicity. A woman, 2 trunks, murder. But human lives rarely remain simple for very long. The truth is more uncomfortable than that. A lonely woman, physically fragile, psychologically unstable perhaps, or perhaps merely frightened beyond reason. A violent night inside an apartment, 2 deaths, and then a lifetime spent carrying the weight of what happened afterward. But what lingers most about Winnie Ruth Judd is not even the murders themselves. It is the escapes, 7 times, across decades. She found openings in the systems designed to contain her. 7 times she stepped beyond locked doors into open air. And the 7th time, she remained free long enough to build something resembling an ordinary life. There is something deeply haunting about that. Not because it erases what happened. Nothing can erase it. But because it reminds us how incomplete public stories often are. The woman inside the headlines was never exactly identical to the headlines themselves. The name Trunk Murderess became larger than the human being beneath it. And somewhere inside that enormous public myth, the actual Winnie Ruth Judd slowly disappeared. A minister's daughter from Indiana, a medical secretary, a tuberculosis patient who came west for survival, a lonely wife, a frightened woman, a fugitive, a psychiatric patient, an old woman tending quietly to household chores in California, while the country forgot her name for a little while. All of those people existed inside the same life, and perhaps that is what makes the story endure. Not certainty, but uncertainty. The terrible possibility that some human beings can spend entire lifetime trying to explain themselves and still remain partially unknowable even at the end. The Arizona desert keeps its heat long after sunset. Long after the air cools, the warmth remains hidden beneath the ground, patient, quiet, enduring through the darkness, and in many ways, the story of Winnie Ruth Judd feels exactly like that. Something buried, something unresolved, something still radiating faintly beneath the surface, long after the world above it has changed.